Hello and welcome into the KE Report. Chad and Corey here, getting an update from Jay Martin, getting him geared up to go to this year's Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. This is January 19th and 20th, so next week. Corey and I will be there in full effect, like we always are, and looking forward to it as really the kickoff of conference season for the mining industry in Vancouver. And Jay, you've put together every year a nice group of speakers, but this year you have some big investment themes that are weaving through the event. Things like de-dollarization, geopolitics, emerging markets, AI. Maybe talk to us about how some of the different speakers that you're bringing in and some of the panels that you put on tie into these different investment themes.
Yeah, certainly, Shad and Corey. Great to see both of you guys. Thanks for having me back on the show. You know what, Chad, I'm always super excited about our agenda. I have a heavy bias, but this year we really went all out, and I'm very excited about what people will see on the stage. I tend to segment the content into three main buckets. And so what you'll see this year is at the very top, we have geopolitics. I think geopolitics matters more to commodity investors than it ever has in my lifetime. I mean, my entire life has been the era of globalization, which has been, increased sharing of goods to whoever had the cash or credit to buy them. And that era is definitely over, right? We're seeing the fracturing of the geopolitical chessboard. New alliances are forming, new adversaries are being made. There's conflicts spreading around the world and lots of stakeholders in those conflicts. But the outcome of that is that countries are becoming a lot less lenient with who they share their resources with. And so, just this week, looking at some of Trump's statements about Greenland, for example, like great example. He's, making a lot of noise about annexing Greenland, but really what he wants is the critical metals in Greenland. And then in addition, he doesn't want China or Russia to have access to them. That's what he really wants. That's the true intention. And so we're seeing more of that, not just countries fighting for access to resources, but also fighting to make sure other countries can't have access. And whenever you mess with the supply chains to that extent, the supply becomes less secure, right? And when the supply of anything is less secure, the value goes up because you'll pay more to secure that, right? And to get that confidence back in your trade systems. So, I think this is reflected in many of the commodity prices, and I think we're just getting started. And so to help our audience understand the complex dynamics of geopolitics in our world today, we brought in some of the best geopolitical analysts in the world, individuals like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Dr. Pippa Malmgren, Dr. Pascal Lota. I mean, these are individuals who can look at the complex conflicts that are occurring, analyze all the stakeholders involved within them, and pull out their core incentives, right? So, take a country like Syria, we have 4 or 5 nations on the ground, different stakeholders, all have different incentives for being there. They want different things out of that conflict. And what these three do a great job at is simplifying those complex conflicts. And then one layer down from geopolitics, we cover macro in a very big way, macro finance and economics, which largely exists in response to those geopolitical events. And so we go there next. And covering these subjects, you'll find individuals like David Rosenberg, Danielle DiMartino Booth, Robert Kiyosaki, Grant Williams, and they do a great job at tracking some of the trends that you just discussed, like de-dollarization and monetary policy, inflation trends, and the inputs that create those outcomes. And then the third layer is we get right into capital allocation in the resource business. And so that's where you'll see individuals like Rick Rule, like Frank Giustra, Ross Beatty, and many, many more. I think we're flying in over 85 keynote speakers to this event. But, I think about my portfolio that way. I like to start right up at the top, figure out the geopolitical models, get down into macro, and then get into capital allocation. So we build the agenda in a very, very similar way. And it's 2 days, 5 stages, lots happening this year.
So, Jay, with a lot of these geopolitical issues, we hear about the de-dollarization, World War III, a lot of these, in a way, kind of gloom and doom topics. But in all fairness, we've been hearing about them for a long time, ever since I've been in this sector. So how are you going to go about tying that more into an investable theme rather than just having people out there more outlining some gloom and doom themes that might not be actually relevant to their overall portfolios?
Yeah, I think helping investors determine the noise from the signal, Corey, is hyper important. And what you just said, there's a lot of sensational, hyperbolic headlines in geopolitics, and those can be a massive distraction and pull people away from what really matters, preventing them from forming a sound thesis. And so, I mean, this week is such a great example. We have the incoming president of the United States sort of making claims on three different regions, right? We're going to annex Canada, we're going to buy Greenland, and we're going to take back the Panama Canal. And those are all really big statements, but you know, are those outcomes probable? Like I'd say none of them are actually, not at all likely. But what he really wants is to just strengthen the US position in advance of Canada-US trade negotiations with the new prime minister. He doesn't want to annex Canada. Maybe he does, but that's not the intention. When it comes to Greenland, he's not looking to buy Greenland. He just wants access to the critical minerals, and he wants to make sure that China doesn't have access. That's the true intention. So you got to get beneath the headline, beneath that narrative, and get to the truth. And same thing in Panama, right? Does he want to take back the Panama Canal by force, or does he just want cheaper fees for sending ships through? That's what he really wants, right? And so you're right, geopolitics is laden with hyperbolic headlines, but if you spend a bit of time looking into the details, which is what we aim to do at this event, and that's what we do on the Jay Martin Show podcast, you get into the true incentives, right? Trade tells the truth, right? Politics are politics, headlines are headlines. Beneath that, you'll find the trade incentives, and that's where the truth lies.
Well, Jay, let's also talk about some of the booths and vendors that are going to be at the event. I always find it fascinating to walk the floor, see the different companies that are there. Of course, they're mostly focused in the resource space, but sometimes there are some other technology companies or other small cap companies in attendance. Can you give us a lay of the land about what the spread's going to be like between, let's say, precious metals, critical minerals, other industries? How will investors showing up to the event see that kind of dynamic reflected on the floor?
Yeah, I mean, we're all in on the hard commodity sector this year. So you're right. In the past, we've had a bit of variety on the floor. This year, what you'll see, Shad, is a lot of gold, a lot of copper, a lot of uranium, and a lot of silver. And then outside of that, you'll definitely see some outliers within the energy metals, a couple nickel companies, but those are the primary, and that's what we're most focused on. So when you walk through the floor this year, there's 250 companies that'll be on that exhibit hall floor. And all those companies are there to meet with prospective shareholders and tell their story and hopefully convince you that they're a great investment opportunity. But then around the perimeter, we sort of provide stress tests on all of those ideas. And so you'll, hit the workshops, hit the main hall, and you'll hear our capital allocators talk about where they're putting cash for 2025. If they're bullish on copper, why that is. If they have hesitations, why that is, right? And then in our main hall, we actually do like full hour deep dives on all of those four. And so you'll find panel discussions that are solely focused on the 2025 copper forecast, gold forecast, silver forecast, uranium forecast. And I've invited a handful of experts that are, either very exposed, well, both very exposed. And then I always try to find one contrarian, one who's not so bullish on that commodity. And if I can't find them, then I play it and I play devil's advocate on the panel. Here's why the copper forecasts are a bit too extreme for my taste, as an example. Yeah, it's important to cover both sides, but that's the makeup this year, Shad.
So, Jay, I'm curious what you're seeing on more the investor front. You really have an inside take, thanks to this conference, of the type of investors that are signing up. And look, I've been going to this conference for, I think, almost 20 years now. And I have to be honest with you, like, we all know that this sector hasn't been bringing in tons of new investors. So when it comes to the registrations that you've seen, not just this year, but even in the last few years, have you noticed any pockets where new investors are coming into the sector? Have you noticed a lot of the same people frequenting these conferences?
Yeah, man, that's such a great question. And you're right. And, 15 years ago, if I would go to a mining conference anywhere in the world, I was often the youngest person there. And for the next few years, I stayed the youngest person there because nobody younger than me was showing up. It was like an entire lost generation. And that began to change at my event about 3 years ago, and then changed in a big way last year. And so last year at this event, 30% of our attendance was there for the first time ever. They'd never been to one of our conferences before. They weren't all new investors, but they were new to the metals and mining sector. Now, Why that's really striking is because if it had been a super hot, frothy market in the mining equities, then that would make sense, right? A hot, frothy market pulls new people in. Look at every time Bitcoin runs, thousands of investors pile into that trade. Every industry is the same like that. But last year was not a frothy market in the mining sector. It was the opposite. It was really hard to make money. So why did our audience grow by 30% of new investors? And the only thing I can point to is that it wasn't just us. We've seen audiences inflate on both of our podcast channels. We launched a second podcast channel, VRIC Media, 18 months ago, and it's growing twice as fast as the Jay Martin Show was growing 3 years ago. All of our peer channels seeing similar growth. And all I can assume is that people are beginning to ask questions they haven't asked before. They're wondering why their life is far more expensive than it used to be. They're wondering why all these conflicts seem to be surging at once, why this decade has been crazy volatile, seemingly without end. And they're asking why. And a percent of those people end up looking at macroeconomics and monetary policy to begin to understand concepts like inflation and currency devaluation, and that the house they couldn't afford last year and is somehow less affordable this year hasn't changed at all. It's the measuring stick that's changed. That's the currency. And those individuals end up in the hard asset camp coming to shows like mine. And I think this is a massive shift in public sentiment. And we're just experiencing a little fraction of it that's showing up at my conference. But that 30%, Corey, they're young. Like last year, 8% of my attendance was under the age of 25. Now, that may not sound like a lot, depending on what industry you're from, but in metals and mining, that's huge. And I was speaking with a lot of literally kids last year. I met a couple of groups of kids that were 17 and 18 years old. One kid was 16. He's in a suit and he's walking around the show. And it was frankly, it was pretty cute. He pulled me aside and said, "Look, I'm really glad that I'm here. Thank you for throwing this event. But I got to be honest, I don't understand anything that's being said from the podium. And I don't know how to begin talking to these companies. I feel like I'm so behind." And, I'm looking at a 16-year-old kid at an investment conference, you're ahead of everybody right now. You're not behind anyone. You're doing fine. But they're showing up. They're showing up in a big way. 8% was under 25. I think it was 23% was under the age of 35, which is a very young shift for us. And so, I think it's for the reasons I just mentioned, but they are showing up. And we're having to adjust the content, Corey, in response. 10 years ago, you were at my event, the majority of content you would see was newsletter writers picking stocks. And that was enough, right? That demographic, that audience, that's what they wanted, stock tips. And today, that's not enough. The younger investors that are showing up want to understand a lot more. They want to understand the background, understand the story, understand the big picture behind the commodity thesis. And so, that's absolutely fueling why we're so big into geopolitics and macro relative to our event 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, Jay, just anecdotally, I had walked around your event last year and talked to several groups of younger investors, and I thought they were somebody's kids, and they said, "No, we're actually investors." And I was talking to them, they were in their early 20s. Another group was in their kind of mid to late 20s. They had groups on Reddit. They were starting up their own podcasts. They were excited about it, but like you say, still hungry to learn, hungry to get that investing fever. But it was encouraging to see. And I want to hone in on one aspect of your event as far as people maximizing it. And I really think one of the highlights for me going to VRIC is the panel discussions that you host. And there's a lot of events that'll throw in one or two panels just to do one, but your event has a real focus on panels. And some of them are where you get that back and forth between different speakers where they build on each other or maybe disagree. So maybe talk about the nature of all the panel discussions that you moderate, why you stack them the way you do, and how investors can learn by sitting in on those kind of discussions.
Yeah, man, 100%. So, as mentioned, we cover those three buckets with those panels. And when it comes to something like our gold forecast, for example, we're looking at the 2025 gold forecast. And what I'll do is try to find a couple investors, an analyst, and maybe a company builder. And so on our gold forecast this year, you'll see David Garofalo, who former CEO of Gold Corp and led the largest transaction in the history of the gold industry between Gold Corp and Newmont. He's a company builder. He's an executive in the space and pays attention through that lens. We have Frank Giustra, who plays both the investor and the company builder side, but his Fiore Group in Vancouver is always incubating a handful of deals in the precious metal sector. And Frank's done incredibly well as both an entrepreneur and investor in the sector. And then somebody like Grant Williams, who really steps back from the mining equities. He's not looking at building gold companies. He's looking at bigger gold trends, central bank buying, et cetera. And so, through that diversity on stage, we try to cover all the bases. You'll find the same in silver and copper. And I do my best. It's sometimes hard, but I do my best to find the contrarian and make sure they're on stage as well. And so, for example, there's a lot of very bullish copper outlooks right now. And I think on that panel, I'm going to be the bear. I'm not, not necessarily bearish on copper, but I'm going to pour a bit of cold water in some of the hyperbolic. We're going to double demand for copper in the next 10 years. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's very strong fundamentals, and I've got money in the copper sector for good reason, and I can explain why, but it's not because we're going to double demand. I just think that's a bit sensational. And so, I try to give investors an honest look as best that we can, right? So you hear the pros, you hear the cons, you hear where the risk is, you hear a bull case and a bear case as much as possible. And on the geopolitical front, a lot of what we're talking about is coming from like an East versus West dynamic. So understanding, who's controlling the raw materials, where they're coming from, and who's buying them. Because at the heart of like any conflict you study at any time throughout history, what you'll generally find at the root of it is a fight over resources. That's almost always the case. And we'll fight over almost any resources. It's amazing. We're all familiar with wars that were fought over oil, but you can look through history and find wars fought over bananas. Like America went to war for bananas in the 19th century in Honduras and Cuba and El Salvador. So when people ask me, would we ever go to war over copper or nickel? It's like, man, I hope not, but we've done crazier things. So, understanding those dynamics is super important. The panels and the debates are my favorite part. And so, yeah, we'll have a heavy focus this year on US dollar trade and what's happening on the margin. So, that's the de-dollarization conversation. How legit is that trend, or is it just a bit of a distraction? How will organizations like the BRICS respond to a very strong-handed American president? They haven't had that in 4 years, and there's been a lot of movement as a consequence. And so taking a look at all of those situations and having some deep conversations around them, that's what I built my panels for.
So one more on the companies then, the exhibitors at the conference. It's one of the main reasons that I go to the conference too, is to touch base with a lot of these companies and see if there are any news stories out there. You get a lot of insights from just talking to management teams directly. Now, a lot of the Cambridge House exhibitors have been generally junior companies. And as much as we've talked about how tough it's been for the juniors out there, can you give us some insights in terms of the types of companies that you have more on the market cap size? Do you have larger companies there? Is it mostly junior focused? What should we be expecting?
Yeah, certainly. So as you know, the market cap is largely a symptom of the market sentiment. And so I could have the same group of companies on my floor 2 years ago, and their market cap would be about 50% higher across the board. And so the average market cap at this event is probably around 80 million, Corey, if I were to give you a guess. And we focus on the junior sector. And that's because, that's where the demand for retail investment comes from. A lot of these bigger companies, they can float out of retail demand and get into institutional money. I run a retail investor conference. That's what I am, right? I'm a retail investor. And so I'm looking for the best opportunity for my cash. And I definitely have a diverse portfolio through production and developers, but I like the asymmetric risk and reward available in the junior market. Now, it comes with tremendous risk. It's a dangerous industry, like any emerging industry is. Any startup ecosystem has a ton of volatility. And so what we hope to do with a conference like this is allow those investors to actually meet the entrepreneur behind the company. And you should always do that. Everybody in this business says, bet the jockey. It's all about the people. People's the number one ingredient. But action that. Don't just listen to it and nod your head. Come to an event like this where you can walk around the trade show floor and meet the entrepreneur before you let them have an adventure with your cash. They're there to meet you. And you can tell a lot about somebody after talking to them for just 10 minutes. And in terms of helping you make a decision whether you should invest your money with that person, absolutely do that. Because when you're investing in a 50 million market cap company, if you're running a private organization, you might be like 50 million's humongous. That's huge for a venture listed company. It isn't. And you're not betting in an industry. You're not betting on a company really at that point. You're betting on the decision making, the integrity, the durability of like one or two human beings that are accountable for your shareholder dollars and the success of that company. And so go meet that individual. We do have larger companies as well, Corey, but it's not our focus. Like I'll sit down with Pan American Silver, I'll sit down with Wheaton Precious Metals, I'll sit down with a Cisco Gold Royalties at this conference, and they're all in the trade show as well. First Majestic, there's many billion-dollar market cap companies that are there, but our focus for sure is the small caps.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there for today, but it's going to be exciting to be at the event like it always is. I encourage people listening, if you want to be at the big kickoff for the resource sector for the whole year, it really happens in Vancouver, really in just about 10, 11 days. So definitely something to put on your calendars. If you can't make it this year, definitely try to make it next year. If you're within driving distance, it's worth the drive in. If you're in flying distance, make the effort, make the investment in yourself. Like you say, before your capital goes on an adventure with these companies, nice to see them face to face. Always amazing talks and panels. Always a lot of interesting investors there to network with and share ideas with. Jay, we really appreciate you coming on the show and highlighting what's going to be at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, January 19th and 20th. We'll put a link to it down below this interview for people that are interested. And we'll also put a link to the VRIC Media channel and the Jay Martin Show channels that you have on YouTube. Lots of great content. I personally check it out all the time. And we just appreciate you coming on the KE Report.
Hey, I really appreciate both of you guys. Thanks so much for what you do in this industry, and thanks for having me on today.